Picture a man alone on a ridge so high the clouds seemed to brush against his weathered cabin roof. Folks down in the valley whispered his name only when they thought nobody else was listening close enough to hear. They called him the outcast, a mountain man who had turned his back on civilization after a betrayal nobody could ever fully explain. He hunted his own meat, mended his own boots, and buried his own grief somewhere deep beneath the pine needles and granite. But even the toughest men grow tired of eating burnt beans and half-raw venison every single night. So when winter crept closer and his hands grew clumsy from frostbite, he finally admitted he needed help he could not provide himself. He rode 2 days down into a rough little town just to post a single crumpled notice on the saloon wall. The words were simple, just a cook wanted for mountain work, pay fair, no questions asked about your past. He had no idea that notice would bring a stranger straight out of a nightmare wearing a borrowed coat and a desperate, calculated smile. That stranger was a man named Silas Cray, though the name on the wanted poster back east reads something entirely different. Silas had broken free from a transport wagon just 3 weeks earlier, leaving 2 guards unconscious and 1 very confused judge without his prisoner. He had been running west ever since, sleeping in barns, stealing horses, and always staying 1 step ahead of the law closing in behind him. When he saw that notice on the saloon wall, something in his gut told him this was exactly the escape he desperately needed. A cabin high in the mountains, far from any sheriff, far from any bounty hunter tracking his scent through the dust. He walked into that saloon with false confidence, claiming years of experience cooking for cattle drives and railroad crews alike. Nobody in that town knew his real story, and honestly, nobody there cared enough to ask twice. The outcast studied him carefully, noticing the nervous way his eyes kept darting toward the door every few seconds. Still, desperation makes a man overlook details he would normally never ignore in safer circumstances. He hired Silas on the spot, unaware he had just invited danger straight into his mountain sanctuary. The ride back up into the peaks took nearly a full day, mostly silent except for the wind howling between the rocks. Silas studied every trail marker, every fork in the path, every possible route he might need someday for a hasty escape. The mountain man, whose real name was Ezra Thorne, rode ahead without saying much beyond simple, clipped directions. Ezra had learned long ago that trust was a luxury few men in these mountains could genuinely afford anymore. Still, there was something about having another human voice nearby that softened the hard edges of his isolation. When they finally reached the cabin, Silas felt a strange, uneasy mixture of relief and calculated opportunity settle over him. This place was remote enough that no lawman would ever think to search these particular ridgelines. It was also isolated enough that if something happened to Ezra, nobody would notice for weeks or months. Silas told himself this was simply survival, nothing personal, just a man doing whatever it takes to stay free. But even as he thought it, some quiet part of him already sensed this arrangement might grow far more complicated than he expected. The first few days passed with surprising ease, and Silas actually proved himself decent enough behind a cooking fire. He learned quickly how Ezra liked his coffee, strong enough to keep a man alert through brutal overnight watches. He noticed the rifle Ezra kept within arm's reach at every single meal, never once out of sight or reach. He noticed too the deep scars along Ezra's forearms, old wounds that told stories neither man was ready to share yet. At night, Silas would lie awake calculating distances, mapping escape routes, wondering exactly how long he could keep pretending to be harmless. Yet something unexpected kept nagging at him, a small flicker of guilt he hadn't felt in years of running. Ezra wasn't cruel, wasn't suspicious without reason, and treated Silas with more decency than most lawmen ever had. That decency cracked something loose inside Silas that he thought had been buried alongside his old, honest life. He began wondering if maybe, just maybe, this mountain could offer him more than merely a hiding place. That single thought terrified him more than any bounty hunter ever could, because it meant he had something left to lose. One evening, while skinning a rabbit near the fire, Ezra finally broke the heavy silence that had lingered between them for days. He asked Silas plainly why a grown man with decent cooking skills was hiding so far from any town or family. Silas's hands froze mid-motion, his mind racing through a dozen different lies he could offer instead of truth. Something about the flickering firelight and the honest weariness in Ezra's voice made lying feel suddenly exhausting and pointless. So instead, Silas told him everything: the wrongful accusation, the rigged trial, the desperate escape through a snowstorm. He expected anger, expected Ezra to reach for that rifle resting quietly against the cabin wall. Instead, Ezra simply nodded slowly, staring into the flames as though remembering something painful from his own forgotten past. He admitted that his own exile from society hadn't been entirely voluntary either, though he refused to share every detail that night. For the first time since his escape, Silas felt something close to being truly seen by another living person. That night, under a sky thick with more stars than either man could ever hope to count, an unlikely trust began quietly forming. But trust in these mountains never stayed simple for very long, especially once outside forces came pushing their way inward. A bounty hunter named Garrett Voss had been tracking Silas's trail for weeks, following whispers, rumors, and one careless mistake back in town. Garrett arrived at the base of the mountain just as the first heavy snows began sealing off the higher passes completely. He questioned townsfolk relentlessly, learning about a mysterious new cook who had vanished up into the outcasts' private territory. Garrett smiled the cold, satisfied smile of a man who smelled reward money hanging thick in the frozen mountain air. He began the long, dangerous climb alone, driven purely by greed and the promise of a substantial cash bounty. Meanwhile, up at the cabin, Ezra noticed distant smoke rising from a fire that definitely wasn't his own creation. His instincts, honed by years of solitary survival, told him danger was climbing steadily closer with every passing hour. He said nothing to Silas yet, choosing instead to quietly load extra ammunition and check every window latch twice. Something dangerous was coming, and both men, despite their tangled histories, would soon have to decide where their loyalties truly belonged. Silas noticed Ezra's tension immediately, the way his jaw tightened and his eyes kept scanning the tree line beyond the cabin. He asked directly what was wrong, and Ezra, after a long pause, finally told him about the distant smoke signal. Silas's stomach dropped, knowing exactly what that smoke likely meant for a man with his particular criminal history. He considered running immediately, disappearing into the storm before any bounty hunter could ever reach the cabin door. But something held him back, some stubborn thread of loyalty he hadn't expected to feel this strongly toward anyone. Ezra had trusted him with shelter, with honesty, with a strange kind of respect Silas hadn't earned in years. Running now would mean abandoning the first real connection he had built since his entire world fell apart. So instead, Silas made a decision that surprised even himself, choosing to stay and face whatever danger was approaching together. He grabbed an old hunting knife from the kitchen table, testing its weight and balance against his nervous, trembling palm. Whatever happened next, he decided, he would not go down without fighting for the fragile new life he'd started building. Garrett Voss reached the cabin just as darkness fully swallowed the mountain, his rifle slung heavy across one exhausted shoulder. He circled the small structure carefully, noting the single-lit window and the thin trail of smoke curling from the chimney above. Inside, Ezra and Silas had already extinguished most lanterns, positioning themselves near opposite windows with weapons drawn and ready. The tension inside that cabin felt thick enough to cut, every creaking floorboard sounding like distant thunder to their strained ears. Garrett called out from beyond the tree line, announcing himself as a lawful bounty hunter seeking a dangerous escaped convict. Ezra shouted back, insisting no criminal lived within his walls, only an honest cook hired fair and square. Garrett laughed coldly, claiming he had proof enough to drag both men down the mountain in chains regardless. Silas felt his pulse hammering against his ribs, every survival instinct screaming at him to run while there was still time. But he stayed rooted beside Ezra, refusing to abandon the strange, unexpected partnership they had built across these brutal mountain weeks. The standoff stretched into a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on the entire frozen mountainside. Then, without warning, Garrett fired a single shot that splintered wood just inches above the cabin's heavy front door. Ezra returned fire instantly, forcing Garrett to scramble backward behind the thick trunk of an ancient pine tree. Silas moved fast, slipping out through the cabin's rear window into the biting cold and swirling mountain snow. His plan was reckless, dangerous, and entirely unlike the careful, calculating man he had been just weeks earlier. He circled wide through the trees, using skills learned from years of avoiding capture across half a dozen frontier towns. Garrett never saw him coming until Silas tackled him hard, sending both men crashing through the frozen underbrush together. They wrestled violently in the snow, fists and elbows flying, breath steaming thick in the freezing mountain darkness. Ezra rushed out from the cabin, rifle raised, unwilling to let his newfound friend face this danger completely alone. Together, the two men who had started as strangers, then employer and escaped convict, finally overpowered the desperate bounty hunter. Garrett lay groaning in the snow, defeated, while Silas and Ezra stood breathing hard, staring at each other in stunned disbelief. They tied Garrett securely, deciding his fate carefully as the storm outside continued howling against the cabin's sturdy walls. Ezra suggested simply releasing him at dawn, far from any trail leading back toward civilization or law enforcement. Silas argued they needed a more permanent solution, something that would buy him real time before pursuit resumed. In the end, they compromised, leaving Garrett bound near the base of the mountain with just enough supplies to survive. It would take him days to walk back to town, days Silas desperately needed to disappear even further west. As dawn broke, painting the snowy peaks in soft shades of orange and stubborn winter gray, the two men faced reality. Silas knew he couldn't stay forever, knew eventually more bounty hunters would come searching these same treacherous mountain trails. Ezra, surprising himself completely, offered something he never thought he would extend toward another living soul again. He offered a permanent place, not as hired help anymore, but as something closer to genuine family and lasting partnership. For the first time in years, Silas allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't involve constant running or fear. Weeks turned into months, and the strange partnership between the outcast and the escaped convict grew steadily stronger and deeper. They built a second room onto the cabin, expanded their hunting grounds, and slowly earned quiet trust from distant neighboring settlers. Silas taught Ezra new recipes using ingredients traded carefully from travelers passing through the lower mountain valleys occasionally. Ezra taught Silas how to track game silently, how to read weather changes, how to truly survive against nature's harshest demands. Neither man spoke often about their pasts anymore, understanding instinctively that some wounds heal better through action than constant conversation. They developed their own rhythm, their own unspoken language built from shared danger, shared labor, and hard-earned mutual respect. Townsfolk down below began telling stories about two mysterious mountain men who seemed inseparable despite wildly different, troubled backgrounds. Nobody knew the full truth, and honestly, both men preferred keeping their history exactly that mysterious and protected. What had begun as a desperate escape plan had transformed into something neither expected, a genuine, unlikely brotherhood forged in danger. The mountain that once represented isolation for Ezra now represented something far warmer, something resembling an actual home. But peace in the Wild West rarely lasted forever, and rumors have a dangerous habit of eventually traveling exactly where they shouldn't. Word slowly spread that Garrett Voss had survived his ordeal, returning east with wild stories about a convict hiding deep in remote mountains. New bounty hunters, hungrier and more determined than Garrett had ever been, began quietly asking questions in towns near Ezra's territory. Silas noticed subtle changes first, strangers lingering too long near the trading post, questions asked just a little too carefully. He warned Ezra one evening, admitting his fear that their peaceful arrangement might soon face serious, unavoidable challenges again. Ezra listened calmly, then said something Silas would remember for the rest of his complicated, hard-fought life. He said that family wasn't about avoiding danger completely, but about facing it together no matter what came. Silas felt something shift permanently inside his chest, a decision solidifying that he would never again run entirely alone. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever hunters came searching these unforgiving peaks, they would face them as true partners. The mountain stood silent and watchful above them, guardian to a bond neither danger nor distance could ever fully break. So that's the story of the outcast mountain man and the escaped convict who changed both their lives forever completely. It's a tale about how trust can grow in the most unexpected, dangerous places, even between two broken, wounded strangers. It reminds us that the Wild West wasn't just about gunfights and outlaws, but about survival, loyalty, and unlikely human connection. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure you smash that subscribe button right now immediately. Hit the like button too, because it genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you incredible frontier stories like this one weekly. I want to know what you would have done in Ezra's position, hiring a stranger despite every warning sign present. Would you have trusted Silas, or would you have turned him away the moment suspicion crossed your mind? Drop your thoughts down in the comments section below, because I read every single one of them personally. Share this video with someone who loves rugged Wild West tales filled with danger, redemption, and unexpected brotherhood. Until next time, partners, stay sharp, stay curious, and I'll see you on the next incredible frontier adventure.